Gracias, Eduardo, por esas palabras. En su discurso hablaba mucho de sostenibilidad y de eso trata precisamente nuestra siguiente ponencia, Objetivos de la Sostenibilidad en la Unión Europea. Y para ello contamos con Tassos, Haniotis, director de Estrategia y Análisis Político de la Dirección General de Agricultura y Desarrollo Rural, Comisión Europea. Le acompaña como moderador Juan Corbalán García, delegado de Cooperativas Agro-alimentarias de España en Bruselas. Aquí les hago un leve apunte. Si ustedes quieren hacer cualquier pregunta al Tassos, no pueden dejar pasar la oportunidad. Tenemos a nuestros equipos de azafatas con unas tarjetas. Ustedes levantan la mano y las preguntas se formularán por escrito una vez termine la ponencia. Es su momento. Muchas gracias.
Sí, hola, buenos días. Vamos a continuar con el Congreso. Tenemos a continuación a Tassos Haniotis, que es el director de Estrategia y Análisis Político de la Dirección General de Agricultura de la Comisión Europea. Tassos es un amplio conocedor de la agricultura europea, pero no solo, sino también a nivel mundial y en concreto en Estados Unidos. Es la dirección que concibe y establece los objetivos estratégicos de la PAC, pero no solo, sino también la contribución de la agricultura en el resto de políticas europeas, en concreto con la aplicación de la estrategia de granja a la mesa. Tassos ha ostentado diferentes cargos en la Dirección General de Agricultura, ha sido director de pagos directos, también ha sido jefe de unidad de análisis y perspectivas de la Comisión Europea y también jefe de unidad de política comercial. Ha trabajado y estudiado en Estados Unidos, tiene un doctorado por la Universidad de Georgia y es economista por la Universidad de Atenas y también es doctor honoris causa por la Universidad de Salónica. Es un, como he dicho, gran conocedor y es un privilegio tenerla aquí porque es quien nos va a establecer los retos de sostenibilidad y seguridad alimentaria en el nuevo contexto geopolítico. Sin más, doy la palabra. Tassos, thank you for coming. It's a privilege to be here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juan. Dear Mr. President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure and a real honor to be here with you. The pleasure is because we are gradually moving into a more normal life. It's not yet fully normal, but at least you can see faces, body language when you speak, and you start realizing whether you're repeating what the previous speakers have said or you have to say something new. The honor has to do with the fact that today is a special day for me because I complete 33 years in the European Commission. I have one more month to go and then I retire from the Commission, I hope not from the scene. And it is a great honor because 33 years ago, on the 1st of July of 1989, it looks like yesterday, a certain Juan Manuel Silva Rodriguez, that many of you know very well, was my first head of unit, both in the European Commission, and with him in the beginning and later on when he became a Director General, and with many others, we followed all the enormous path of transformation of European agriculture, which for me started when I was doing my PhD in the United States because it was focusing on the impact of the Spanish and Portuguese accession on US agricultural exports. Now, in all these years, one of the things that we witnessed is the enormous transformation of the Spanish agricultural sector, the way the sector became an export giant, and the manner by which the cooperatives played a crucial role. But I'm not here to talk about this because there are others that are much more experts about that. I'm here to talk to you about something that, in a certain way, we expected to discuss, which is the link between food security and climate action, the manner by which we will make our agriculture more competitive, because part of the success of the Spanish and the EU agriculture was economic and social, in its economic and social dimension. Part of the weaknesses were in the environmental front. So we were expected to discuss this, and lo and behold, something else popped up, which we never expected that we'd have to deal in Europe again, which is war. You heard my commissioner before. I'm not going to repeat what he said. What I will try to do immediately is take you into the current context of what we face with the manner by which prices of all commodities at world level developed. This graph starts back in the 1960s, so it takes a very long point of view, and it looks at real prices, not the ones that you farmers will face. I'll talk about the nominal prices afterwards, but the ones that we, as economists, translate, taking into account the annual rate of inflation. What you see there in green, both in the straight line that moves up and down and the dotted line that tries to see whether we have a trend, is the evolution of agricultural prices. And agricultural prices over the long period have always been going downwards with ups and downs. And we have a question mark about where they're going to go right now in the future. And this is linked to what is happening in all other prices. First of all, in the line that starts in the bottom, the red line is energy. And energy is crude oil, energy is coal, and energy is natural gas. And this graph has them together. You will see in another one they're split. And of course, they have been moving upwards. What you have with blue is metals and minerals. That is a reflection of the economic cycle with the role of China and India very important there. And you also have in the dotted purple line fertilizer prices. And what you see is that in recent times, all prices move together, all prices are moving upwards, and in all of this move of prices, what we have are factors that are totally exogenous to agriculture. So if we go into the next slide, which is the type of prices that you farmers face, these are the nominal prices. What we see, and that's a more recent graph, its starting point is 2016, the ups and downs that you were facing in the markets that could be in the range of 10 and 20%, significant enough, look irrelevant when we see what is happening right now, because there is a dramatic increase of prices that has started already as we were moving out of COVID, accelerated last summer with the first geostrategic tensions, and has really exploded after the war. And it includes in agriculture, and it includes also oils and meals, foods, and grains. In fact, what we see here is the fact that all prices are moving up, but some prices, especially grains and oil and meals, move much faster than others. The next slide is indicative of the very significant pressures that the input cost in agriculture faces. Crude oil has not increased as impressively as other times here. The big player is natural gas. For Europe, natural gas prices are the ones in the blue line that keep going up and down, way above anything else. I've put urea and fertilizers, and in the bottom with the red line is the natural gas price in the US. And it's very interesting to look at what happened last year. US natural gas prices doubled, natural gas prices in Europe quadrupled. And because we are actually purchasing natural gas liquefied from the US, natural gas prices in the US started increasing more. What is also very interesting to see is the next slide that comes from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank and others. In red, you have the World Food Price Index. In blue, you have, in different regions of the world, the inflation rate. So what is impressive is that food inflation is much higher than the overall rate of inflation. The same thing applies for energy. So it's energy and food that are putting all prices up. And on the right-hand side, you see the food price inflation in some developing countries of the world, and not that developing, Argentina is also there, that are extremely high. Now, behind all this, there are multiple factors, including the very asymmetric exit from the COVID. But there is one that is in everybody's minds. The Commissioner already mentioned that, and that is the Russian invasion in Ukraine and what it's doing to the world markets. The best way to see it is what is happening in wheat. On the left-hand side, you have the two old giants of wheat exports, the US and the EU. From 1990 to 2019, in a span of 30 years, combined EU and US lost 7 million metric tons of surplus. They're still exporters, they still have surplus, but it's 7 million metric tons less. That is not because of the EU. We increased our exports, it's because of the US. China and India, the other two agricultural giants that were on the low side on wheat, have gained 12 million metric tons in terms of net surplus. If you skip a little bit the next and go to the other traditional exporters, Canada, Argentina, and Australia, they have slightly increased their surplus by 2 million metric tons. So what do you have? You have Russia and Ukraine that over 30 years increased their exportable surplus in wheat by 66 million metric tons. And on the right-hand side, you have the rest of Asia and Africa that have increased their deficit of wheat by 62 million metric tons. And that brings you very clearly the enormous food security challenge that we're facing right now, because with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, what we have is actually a complete blockade of the part that Ukraine plays in world wheat markets. And you can find replacements in maize or in vegetable oils, but it's very hard to find out replacement for the 20-odd million metric tons that could be coming and should be coming out of Ukraine. In fact, the impact of the Russian invasion in the EU is that we are particularly exposed because of the proximity and trade relations with both Russia and Ukraine. We're largely self-sufficient. We're not going to run out of food in the European Union. But that does not mean that we should forget that we're not alone in this world, and there are going to be parts of the world that will face a problem of availability, and everybody faces a problem of affordability because prices are high everywhere. There are reduced imports of maize, wheat, rapeseed, and sunflower oil. And of course, this has implications on feed prices and in food processing that all of you have faced in your day-to-day work. Our livestock producers are looking for alternative supplies, and they have to adjust their feed rations. Prices remain high, and this has an impact both on the capacity of farmers to purchase inputs, especially fertilizers, but also on the capacity of low-income households to pay for food. So the picture is not exactly what you call bright. In fact, if you look briefly on the macroeconomic outlook, on the left-hand side, you have what is happening in crude oil and natural gas price, both currently and the forecasts are for prices to stay high up until 2023. And on the right-hand side, what you have is since December of 2019, that is just before we had the beginning of COVID, with the bars in yellow, it's the evolution of farmers' price index. In previous times, you would have said if in 3 years output prices for farmers went up by 20%, that would have been paradise for the farming community. But if you look at all the input costs, from freight to energy to fertilizers, they all have gone up much more than output prices, putting a real squeeze in the margin of farmers. Now, you would say, what have we done with that, and how does this fit with a discussion about the future CAP and the farm-to-fork strategy? The next slide I will show you is not to go over it. I mean, this is if you want to take a look when you have free time. It was first presented and as you see, it's pretty complex. It was first presented by me in the European University Institute back in September of 2019, and it shows that when it comes to the farm-to-fork, in DG Agri, that is still the previous commission, we have already started identifying in all the 3 layers of the food processing the key drivers for the EU food systems and the key challenges we faced. And you can go over and see, and we have seen, in my view, we have managed to capture almost everything except one, which is called war. In fact, in the upper right-hand side, we talk about macro and trade tensions, but these macro and trade tensions did not include war, even in the foresight exercise of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission last year. A hybrid type of war between Russia and Ukraine was an extreme scenario, and it's now in reality. And what this implies is that we have an additional task on the traditional one that we knew that we had to deal with the new Commission, which is climate change. What you have in this graph, just as a reminder of the long-term challenges that are still there with us, is the main climate change impact on agriculture in the different biogeographical regions in the European Union. And the regions are what they are. I think there are 5, 6 different types of regions. In every single one of them, if you go into the details, and the PowerPoint will be available, you can do it freely, you will see everywhere there is an increase in the context of risk. But speaking about climate change and climate action, I think one thing that is important is to put things in context. And this slide shows what is happening in the global context because it shows the change in total emissions from agriculture by source from the period 1990 to 2017. That's the latest one we have data. And what you see is in all the big players, EU, without UK, it's EU 27, this one, US, China, India, Brazil, and the world as a whole, the European Union is the only part of the world that managed to reduce its emissions stemming from agriculture. Everybody else has increased emissions from a little to a lot. Let me be very clear. The message here is not we've done our homework and we can sit comfortably and wait for the others to come where we are. We need to keep leading as we led in this particular process. But we also need to move away from this never-ending polarization between a self-congratulation of the European Union for what we have done and a self-flagellation for the catastrophes that we have brought. Because the world is much more complex. There are lessons to be learned from this progress. Very important lessons about the type of efficiency gains of European agriculture throughout the food system and what it tells us. But there is also another lesson that what we have done is not enough, and we should never forget about it. So where we go from here in being more ambitious? The first thing we have to see is, have we seen what we face right now, and what are the similarities and differences? Many people bring into mind the commodity price boom of 2008-10 and compare it with the recent one. I mean, there are some very clear similarities. We have high prices, co-movement of all prices, they're moving in the same direction, and very high volatility in both cases. We also have energy cost as the big driver of prices that also pulls fertilizer prices up. And we had very similar food security concerns. Concerns with respect of affordability, food is becoming expensive, concerns with respect to availability, mostly in Africa. But there are very significant differences in the two commodity booms. The macroeconomic factors differ, because in one we had a demand-driven debt crisis at the time that we thought that the law of gravity doesn't apply to prices, especially house prices. Everything could keep going up forever. And we had a hard landing back then. What we have right now is supply chain bottlenecks and a very high level of inflation, and on top of that, war. Natural gas prices in 2010, 8 and 10 were the lowest energy prices. It was a time that the Americans had come up with what they call the shale gas revolution, and natural gas was cheap. It was crude oil that was expensive. Today, while all energy prices are up, it's natural gas prices that are driving everything higher than anything else. And that's a very important interest for the agricultural sector because the direct and indirect linked with fertilizer, and a very much of interest for the European economy because of its link to our energy dependence. And what we also have very different is back in 2008-10, we had very low levels of stock. in grains. There was a very significant agricultural factor at play, driven by weather events, especially in Australia and other parts of the world. Right now, before the war in Ukraine, we didn't have a single agricultural factor affecting because stocks were pretty comfortable. And if Ukraine were able to export what is blocked, stocks would be still relatively comfortable. So what are the broader risks to agriculture? The first one is that we have exogenous factors that dominate the debate. And our farm policy toolkit is limited to address issues like that. You've heard the Commissioner with a long list of what we try to do. But you all know very well that it will have an impact in mitigating some of the losses, but it's not going to be this that will change dramatically the overall situation. We have the need to differentiate strategically natural gas sources, and that will keep EU energy prices in the short term high. And also the green transition affects energy, metals, and minerals, for which we're also dependent in terms of imports, and that raises some geostrategic tensions. So what are the policy responses? In the short term, we do whatever we can at multi-level to support and show our solidarity to Ukraine. From political, we accepted its request for accession, diplomatic, military aid, humanitarian, financial, material. Energy, we're trying to cut our dependence from Russia and guarantee the substitution of our sources and types of energy. And in agriculture, I'm not going to spend anything more because I think the Commissioner covered fully what we're doing in agriculture, both for our farmers and the Ukrainian farmers. Now, there are some global food security risks and needs that we need to take into account. The first thing is that we have to cut down all this nonsense that supposedly these are sanctions that put at risk food security in Africa. What puts food security at risk in Africa is the fact that the Ukrainians cannot export their grain. It's as simple as this. There is a cause and an effect, and you cannot just turn the world upside down because you'd like to put some propaganda. But here, I don't have to convince you. We have to convince some other parts of the world that are a bit naive in their argumentation. Now, and part of the reason is that our EU sanctions clearly exclude foods, and on purpose, of course. I mentioned already before that food affordability is a problem for everybody, and the food availability is a particular problem for wheat, not only for this year, but also for the next couple of years. That's why it's very important to see what we do in terms of derogations in the European Union, but also how we pass a very simple message. We have 100 million hectares of arable land in the European Union. We have the highest wheat yields in the world, double the world average. And we should be confident that our farmers will look at the price differentials and shift internally crops in order to be able to contribute to reducing this food security problem worldwide. And we are also very confident that they can do that being sustainable as they have been. Now, in terms of the long-term resilience, the new CAP has introduced transitional measures and the possibility to move towards less energy-intensive farming models. And less energy-intensive farming models applies to all practices, all the way from precision farming to agroecology to organic farming. Increasing the energy efficiency is a must and is also not just a challenge but an opportunity, because we know that in these best practices there are good examples that are out there. We have, and that's the other challenge, to have access to new technologies that are intensified, because while best practices are there, the transfer of this knowledge is not everywhere the same, because the farm advisory systems are not working in the same way everywhere, and because of digitalization, we do have gaps that we need to cover. And the technological transition has to be intensified, and that raises the manner by which we address new technologies, and especially biotechnology in Europe. In COVID, we have seen the impact of biotechnology in producing very fast vaccines that helped us going slowly back to normal. Now, if a technology is able to address human health challenges, animal health challenges, why isn't it able to address plant health challenges? And this type of attitude that we have in Europe towards science is something that we need to see how to address, because the debate didn't need to start with agricultural biotechnology. The debate started, if you want, years ago with questions on whether we need to vaccinate children or not. And we have ended up now having the reappearance of diseases that we thought were gone. So I think, for me at least personally, having seen this debate over 25 years now, the most important thing is not to talk about individual items, but give the big battle about what science and knowledge does and how to address both the risks that entail, that are inherent in new technologies, but also the enormous benefits and where we find the right balance. Now, these were not, what I described to you before was not totally unnoticed when we started discussing the future CAP back already in January 2017. In fact, if you take out war, there is not a single aspect and element that I discussed that we haven't put into discussion, including the link between agriculture and health. The first workshop we did in preparing the impact assessment was on the use of antibiotics in animal feed. And because this graph has gone out many times, I will not expand into it, but go straight into the new horizon for the EU policies and how we address what we have. Now, there is going to be growing pressure in the short term, which requires, and I mentioned, the Commission already mentioned before me, short-term actions, whether these are exceptions in the ecologically focused area, additional income support to farmers, and the rest. There is a need to use midterm tools. And the midterm tool we have at hand is the strategic plans that the member states are preparing to foster exactly these types of sustainable intensification and technological change that should accelerate the transition to more sustainable productivity. And when it comes to the long term, we need to anticipate geopolitical context and all the radical changes that it will entail. Agricultural markets, when eventually all wars end, when the war ends, the agricultural markets are not going to be the same as before, with a big unknown, the level of prices at which they will operate. Trade flows and alliances are not going to be the same across the globe. And what you might have is sort of a risk price premium, because one could say if it happened to Ukraine, it can happen in other parts. Now, how exactly do we address this situation is going to be the big challenge we face. And on top of this challenge is the higher costs, increased pressures across the food chain. So we need much stronger incentives for farmers' cooperation, and I'm speaking and preaching to the converted already here, because you are the best example of what stronger farmer cooperation can do. We have to clearly address all the management of natural resources problems we have, water, fertilization of land, chemical use, and better manage it at a collective level, especially because the transfer of the knowledge of best practices has to happen among farmers, and that's where the role of cooperatives is very crucial. And we also need to accelerate the access to knowledge and to digital solutions to the farming community. And I think here, another personal opinion if you want, because the next slide is all personal opinions, since the last one. I mean, we do have a policy whose leverage is on land use. The paradox in the European Union is that with land use, we have an impact on soil, but we don't have a soil directive. We have a water directive, air quality directive, biodiversity directive, but not soil directive. And yet, what the CAP can do and demonstrate is that with better management, soil practices, you have a real effect that is becoming positive. So let me finish with three areas where I see a polarization around false dilemmas. The first one, which is not new, I mean, you see it even in the Paris Agreement, the way to address it, food security or climate action. I mean, the best way to address it is ask the question, do we need stomach or lungs? For life, we need both. and we need both for agriculture. We need to address both climate change and food security. Food security is a global problem. The definition, all people at all times have physical and economic access to nutritious food. Climate change is also a global problem, and there are very significant trade-offs that need to be recognized between what happens at local and global level, because it's only by recognizing the tensions that we can actually develop the necessary synergies, that some of them are already in place. I don't know why the Spanish translation put something in red there. In mine, in English, is not. But anyway, the second false dilemma is, do we need to support public goods or private and public goods? Now, clearly, environmental problems are a textbook definition of where markets fail. But markets do not only fail in the delivery of public goods. They also fail, especially in the agricultural area, in the delivery of the private goods, because price transmission is not perfect, and because farmers are squeezed at both sides. And that's why addressing the joint delivery of the private and public goods, the joint increase in the economic and in environmental performance is a must. Now, there is a more sexy word in modern-day jargon. It's called sustainable productivity, but we have been developing this theme since at least 2008. And the third false dilemma about local and global. I mean, you need both. There are very many areas where local solutions correct some of the very concrete problems that globalization generates, because globalization increases the overall welfare, but it generates not only winners, but losers, and requires mechanisms whereby winners compensate the losers. And the world doesn't have mechanisms like that, at least to the extent that the European Union has. What we also need to keep in mind is that there are going to be very significant challenges from a geostrategic point of view and changes in trade flows that will also require strengthening the local dimension. But we should not lose from sight the fact that the European Union is and should continue to be a net exporter of high-value, sustainable agricultural products. And this we can do by promoting local solutions, learning from them, and also breaking out of the world a model of agricultural and food systems that we should be confident that could prove in practice that is, in the future, even more sustainable and efficient than what it is today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bueno, tenemos unos minutos para algunas preguntas que queráis hacer. Como ha comentado la presentadora, pues podéis darle a la azafata algunas preguntas que queráis hacer. Bueno, Tassos ha explicado muy bien los retos de seguridad alimentaria y de sostenibilidad que se están debatiendo a nivel de Bruselas, en un contexto en el cual pues, ha cambiado, el paradigma ha cambiado, tenemos una guerra en Europa que ha cambiado todo. Y antes pues, se hablaba poco de seguridad alimentaria, de hecho la PAC estaba en el tratado de la PAC, en su constitución, y sigue más en vigor que nunca, pero también hay mucha presión de muchas ONGs y muchas organizaciones en el cual pues, que el cambio climático está ahí, por lo tanto hay que no olvidar los retos de sostenibilidad, pero por otra parte también la Unión Europea está haciendo sus deberes. Hemos visto el gráfico que a mí me ha gustado particularmente, de que la Unión Europea es la única región que está disminuyendo sus emisiones. De hecho, la agricultura y ganadería europea representa solamente el 1% de las emisiones de CO2 a nivel mundial. Por lo tanto, a nivel europeo se está haciendo los deberes, pero sí que existe un reto de seguridad alimentaria. Yo tengo aquí una pregunta de Gabriel Tranzado al respecto. Tassos, ¿cómo crees que debemos abordar en la Unión Europea la comida asequible? Tenemos una inflación galopante en la Unión Europea, a pesar de que España no tiene la inflación más alta de la Unión Europea. De hecho, los últimos datos de abril, de mayo, La tasa de inflación de España está por debajo de la Unión Europea, a pesar de ser la tasa de inflación más alta en los últimos 30 años. No es de la más alta de la Unión Europea. Sin embargo, la inflación de la alimentación es muy alta. En algunos países de la Unión Europea es el 20% de inflación de la alimentación. ¿Cómo crees que abordar la comida asequible con el reto de los costes de producción a nivel del agricultor y también de la rentabilidad de los productores? ¿Cómo crees que esos tres retos a nivel de las políticas europeas podemos abordarlos?
There you go. I think the question is extremely important because it addresses one of the areas where I think there is a lot of misunderstanding and, in my view, also wrong signals that we have sent to the rest of the world. There are even, I mean, there is academic work, there is even a coalition actually at the UN Food System Summit that wants to claim that we need to make food more expensive to cover environmental costs that are not there. I think we need to cover environmental costs, but we cannot afford the luxury, if you want the arrogance, of claiming that food has to become more expensive. To whom are we addressing the issue? Are we addressing it to consumers that could afford a higher cost of food, or are we addressing it to the wider part of the population that have as much right as anybody else to enjoy food that is nutritious and sustainable at the same time? And what we have done is we have forgotten what, over the decades, has made food cheaper in terms of the overall cost that households face, which is productivity growth. The usual reaction of farmers, and you know very well because you have been behind all these reactions, where we make any proposals to increase the environmental performance of the common agricultural policies, but you increase our costs. And in the short term, there is an impact. But let's be clear, first of all, apart from the increase in the marginal costs, there are also technologies and practices that reduce costs and can shift, if you want, the supply curve to the right, that is, potentially make food again cheaper than what it is today. The question is, how do we do that? And out there, that's another one of these false polarizations we have, there is a real healthy competition among best practices. We have the tendency to claim, it's either going to be organic, it's precision farming, it's agroecology, and nothing else. It's all three together and many more. It depends on the context. It depends on whether you do have a strong demand for organic products and where you have them, and closer to the cities, areas where value added is most possible. It depends what type of technology you have available for the big arable mass of land that we have available. It depends on how we transfer knowledge of these best practices. And I will finish that with a very simple example. It's probably 4 or 5 years back that the Joint Research Center did a very simple analysis. They had the map of the European Union with where we would be by now, actually, if we continued the trend of practices in the European Union, and then they took the best practices and applied them where they were possible. And all of a sudden, the whole picture of the European Union became much greener. And the type of literature review and the list of all these practices that are available in the European Union is what the Joint Research Center has given to the member states now that they prepared the strategic plans. So I think there is no magic solution. You cannot pull a rabbit out of a hat, but you can have a combination of little actions. Each one of may look small, but if they move in the same direction, can have a multiplier effect. And I believe that we need to show much more confidence in ourselves, exactly looking at what you mentioned before, the fact that we already managed to address challenges where others didn't do it, to be able to come up with solutions here as well.
Sí. Tenemos, bueno, la verdad es que esta pregunta ha venido, la última que me que me pasan es la que iba a hacer yo. Esto es, muchos de los aquí presentes se lo preguntan y nos lo preguntamos. En el contexto actual de la sostenibilidad ambiental, la Unión Europea no puede sola hacer frente. La Unión Europea es el principal importador de alimentos agroalimentarios, de alimentos en el mundo, y por tanto, a pesar de que muchos esfuerzos pueden hacerlos los agricultores europeos, solos no pueden luchar contra el cambio climático, que es global. En este contexto, ¿cómo crees que las políticas europeas pueden contribuir a que también las importaciones de terceros países puedan contribuir a la sostenibilidad, y si las reglas europeas en materia de sostenibilidad también pueden ser implementadas en los países terceros para que las importaciones que recibimos aquí también cumplan con las reglas europeas en materia de sostenibilidad ambiental, que suponen también un coste añadido para los productores europeos? ¿Cómo crees que las importaciones europeas de alimentos pueden contribuir también a la sostenibilidad ambiental?
Exactly, because this question focuses on standards. I want you all, for one moment, to get out of your current shoes as representatives of a certain sector and turn the question around. One of the distinctive features and standards of the European Union, which puts it apart from most of the world, is democracy. Do we ever ask the question, do we wait for others to reach us to improve our democracy? We don't. So when we talk about standards, there is always something where we have to give a very clear answer. What we do as a European Union, we do it because we consider for the type of farming sector we want to have, for the type of the new generations of farmers that want to find soil that is more productive than what is right now, we're going to develop these particular standards. And that implies that there is always going to be a certain cost that is going to be higher than other parts of the world that we need to be able to cover with innovation and productivity. That being said, we should also not forget that already there are mechanisms which are allowed, by the way, by the WTO to address these issues. You cannot import food whose safety standards inside the EU are different than the standards that we impose in food safety to our own production. Does this imply on environmental products? It implies when it comes to residues. It doesn't imply when it comes to the local conditions that would apply and the impact it would have to other parts of the world. So we need to draw this distinction. We are doing, and we will continue doing, as much as we can, and the best way to do it is to be able to convince others about what I mentioned before. We're dealing with global problems that need to have global solutions. And there are examples in parts of the world where environmental sensitivity is increasing as well. And that's where we need to work to reduce the cost between our own production and the production of others. But again, for me, the most important thing is, do we believe that we have to do it for our own purpose? And are there ways that demonstrate we can do it by reducing our cost of production more than what we do already?
Podríamos estar aquí toda la mañana debatiendo con él. Bueno, es un privilegio tener aquí al director de la DG Agri, responsable de concebir las políticas y estrategias europeas en materia de agricultura, pero el tiempo no da para más. Thank you very much, Tassos, for coming. Acabamos aquí, damos la palabra pues, a la presentadora. Muchas gracias.